Welcome to the BFI Women with a Movie Cameras Summit. This is the first event of the summit, very exciting. I hope you're going to have a wonderful weekend. My name's Anna Smith. I'm a film critic, broadcaster, and host of the Girls on Film podcast. So guess what? I'm a big fan of the person I'm about to speak to now. She's Claudia Weill, the director of Girlfriends. Welcome, Claudia. Talk to me first about the inspiration behind Girlfriends, because it's such an iconic film to so many people.
Oh, okay, that's a good one. Yeah, so Girlfriends was the inspiration was what was happening in my own life, right? Both my sisters, all my girlfriends were getting married, and I wasn't, and I felt like a freak. And emotionally, the loss that Susan experiences is kind of what I went through over and over. And also, so I thought, well, let's make a film about it, start from what you know.
That's such a true thing. And I think Girlfriends is a great example of that, because it's clearly coming from such a great place of truth, which makes it very relatable. But also, I've heard you speak about the idea that the central character is someone who's usually the sidekick in other movies, and you wanted her to be at the middle. I love that. Tell me more about that.
Well, the kind of sort of funny, quirky, kind of slightly overweight, not the perfect young woman, not the blonde with the perfect features and so forth, not the Mary Tyler Moore character, but the sidekick, the Rhoda character. I was a Rhoda, and it became, I think protagonism is very political. Who is the subject of your film? Tells you about your values. And that's kind of intellectual when I'm saying that, but I was trying to say, well, I'm worth having a film about. Or people like me, the sidekick is just as interesting as the so-called leading lady. We're all interesting.
And what kind of challenges did you come up against, if any, about making a film with that kind of protagonist?
Well, since the roots I was going were grants, from the AFI, New York State Council for the Art, National Endowment for the Art, there weren't any barriers subject-wise. I think if I had tried to go to Hollywood and get this financed, I wouldn't have had a chance, right? But it was basically made with grants, and then finally a kind of tiny bit of finishing money that I raised. But by then they could see enough of the film to understand why they should invest in it. So it's a different,
And once you were on set directing, is there a moment where you kind of felt, oh, wow, I'm so happy this is all coming together? Or was it all completely nerve-wracking?
It was pretty nerve-wracking, I get really anxious. I think a lot of people do. I teach a lot, I teach directing a lot, and all the students are anxious, and I try and tell them everybody is, doesn't matter how many films you make. But I was really an innocent, so I remember the first day of the shoot of Girlfriends. Fred Murphy and I were on 79th and Broadway on, I think, the east side of the street, and Melanie and Anita were in the island, and they were supposed to cross towards us, and we were there, and he started rolling. He said rolling, and after he said rolling, I didn't understand why they didn't start walking towards us. And I asked Fred, why aren't they walking? And he said, you have to say action, and I thought, I didn't understand. I thought action was some like movie version of how it happened, like a guy in jodhpurs with a whip and a bullhorn. I thought saying action was sort of a dramatized notion of movie making. I didn't realize it was actually how to function. It's that kind of naivete, you see.
Well, I guess when you're you never really see other directors doing their jobs, and they're doing it independently. So that must be quite a weird feeling.
It's like Mike Nichols said famously, it's like sex. You think everybody else knows what they're doing. Right?
That's a great quote. So true. How do you know?
How do you know?
Tell me about some key scenes in the film, either that you have really strong memories of or that people have really responded to, or both.
I think people respond to the relationship between Susan and Anne. So there are a lot of those scenes. Some of the scenes that stand out for me are the scenes with Eli Wallach, you know, the ones in the office, both the one at night where she talks about wanting to be a rabbi, and they sort of make this wonderful, playful connection. And the other scene that I love from The Office is when she comes to meet him as they had arranged on Sunday to get brunch. And his wife walks in, you know, and she's completely casual. She's not suspicious. She's just picking up the tickets for the football game they're going to. And, you know, I love some of those. Those are some of my favorite scenes. Also the scenes with Seal, the hitchhiker.
I did try to call you. He managed to get the tickets at the last minute. Yes, Jesse. Yes. Well, isn't the Schiefer Auditorium large enough?
I don't know how I let myself get talking to this one, but this is the last one, Aaron.
How many hours? We'll need 2 hours. Well, how many chairs? 300 pounds of fruit. That's a lot of fruit, isn't it, Jesse?
It's the last time, Aaron.
Yes. Yes, Jesse, right.
Hello. Hi. You ever been to a football game? No? You keep it that way.
Eleanor, this is Susan Weinblatt. Susan, this is my wife, Eleanor.
Right. Yes. Yeah. They're
Right,
terrific.
right?
Yeah.
A great character. And also Chris Guest. So, you know, he wasn't playing the boyfriend. He was a specific, idiosyncratic, strange wit, but very vulnerable, you know. Just love those scenes too. I don't know. I have plenty of scenes I don't like. I'm not going to tell you which ones.
Oh,
but,
really?
Yeah.
I can't believe that, because they're
Yeah,
all
no, it's
fantastic.
true. It's true.
Are there anything that you wanted to put in the film that you didn't have a chance to in the final edit?
I don't remember.
Right.
To be honest, it's been 40 years. I don't remember. No, you know, I think the process of editing a film is like, it's like making a sculpture. You take out what's not necessary, you know, and you're left with what's essential. I mean, I think a lot of things happened in editing that changed the film a bit. You know, finally, all films are documentaries, even narrative films, because what's the footage telling you? What's the performance telling you? What are the moments that are vital and that, you know, touch you? Yes, hopefully they're similar to the script, what was important in the script, but if it's not, you have to either go with the footage or you have to recreate what the script intended somehow, if you haven't gotten it in the scene. And for instance, the ending of the film originally was a scene up in the country there with Susan and Anne, and they're by the fire, they're doing Fuzzy Duck. And then both Martin and Chris Guest's character arrive, and there's a scene between the four of them. And I knew as we were shooting it, this is not the right scene to end the film on. It's just not, I don't know what's wrong with it. You know, I thought it tied up all the stories, Susan and Anne, Susan and Eric, blah, 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 the marriage. Blah, blah. But as I was editing, I realized the really important thing, the film is about Susan mostly. And so we need to follow Susan's arc. And, you know, I was talking to a friend about it, and he said, so what do you want to say? And I said, well, I guess in the beginning, Susan is completely shook when Anne gets married and leaves her alone. And by the end, when Martin arrives, and it's just now in our minds, it's just Martin alone. She says, Martin, she's okay. She's fine. She's fine on her own. She's grown herself a life, a soul, a self, right? But I hadn't shot that, right? So I had to, like a documentary, pick through all the little pieces of film. And coming from documentary, I tend to tell Fred or whoever's shooting to start rolling even before I say roll, and to keep rolling even after I say cut, so that I have moments of relaxation or whatever that actors will do in between takes or just thinking. And so I found some footage of, there was this one shot of Anne saying, oh, it's Martin. And they were pretty drunk because we were using real tequila. And then there was a shot that must have been after a take and before another one where Susan just kind of looks down and smiles. And that was the end of the film. You know, it was just a serendipitous little piece of film. And it wasn't a very long piece of film, so we had to freeze on it. But that's the ending of the film, and that whole end scene was discarded.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about one of the themes that really appeals to me. Obviously, there's a lot about female friendship, which is fantastic, but also I was really impressed with the idea of women supporting women in their careers. You know, the idea that one photographer would say to another, look, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You should speak to this person, and, you know, helping each other out. Yes, I'm envious of you for getting a show, but hey, let me help you. All that. Fantastic. Talk to me more about that.
Well, it was very much the ethos of the moment. It was the 70s. It was the beginning of second wave feminism. We were all beginning to realize how we'd been set up to compete with each other.
Right.
And we're trying to compensate. You know, it was the beginning of the kind of notion of sisterhood is powerful. You know, and we found, you know, enormously, the few of us who were working together, like Honor Moore, the poet, whose poems we used for Anne. You know, she said, I'm going to invest in your film. I'm going to invest my sister, and she's going to work as your PA for the whole film. I'm going to pay her. You know, stuff like that. You know, we were really invested in each other on every level. You know, as girlfriends, as friends. And I think that's what I was experiencing then, and the film comes out of that, I think, or reflects it.
It's interesting that it's something that we're talking about on my podcast, Girls on Film, now, that we feel like as a kind of another resurgence and a time when women, with Time's Up and Me Too, and you know, a time when women need to do that again, because a lot of actresses have been pitted against each other and now finally talking to each other. I mean, do you feel that it's kind of cyclical? You know, do you feel that things have gone back since the 70s and need sort of to return to where you were then?
It's a hard question to answer. I don't think it's, well, maybe it is cyclical. I think identity politics is very confusing, you know. I mean, I think we're trying to think broader now in a way, trying to understand and identify with women of color, Indigenous women, you know, not just all us white broads who have gone to college and have this privilege and advantage to be making these films in the first place. So I think that's a lot what's changed.
Very interesting. And I would agree. Thinking of representation, I mean, obviously your character is Jewish and we explore her life in that regard. What do you think is the importance for you of showing Jewish young women on screen and the kind of decisions that they make in their lives?
I think it's important. I mean, when I was growing up, there were some very horrible Jewish female stereotypes. The overbearing mother who dominates her sons, especially, you know, which came out of all these Jewish families coming from Europe, where the husband was the Torah scholar or the Talmud scholar, and the woman had to support the whole family and manage the kids and do everything. Of course, she became a balabosta. But then it became a stereotype, right? Of this overbearing woman a la Portnoy and so forth. And then there was always the Jewish American princess, you know, who's entitled and incompetent. And somewhat like the, you know, the daughter in like, what's her name? Berlin in Heartbreak Kid, Elaine May's daughter, you know? So I wanted to show a Jewish character that wasn't a stereotype. It was just one of the aspects of who she was.
And the scene when she talks about wanting to be a rabbi is one of my favorites. I thought that's
right.
just a lovely scene. And I just
That
hadn't
comes
seen
straight out of
anything.
my grandfather, my father's family was Orthodox. So that was something I realized very young, that what he was doing, you know, on Shabbat in the morning, wrapping tefillin, he was talking to God. I thought that was cool. I would like to talk to God, you know, and I was kicked out too, you know, so the story came out of my own life.
I mean, it looked like God was right there in the room with him. So I started to open the door, slowly. But he saw me, and he said, very quietly, he said, "Get out." So I decided that if he wasn't gonna let me talk to God, I would just have to talk to God myself. So when I was seven, I decided to become a rabbi.
You would have made a great rabbi.
Thank you. Did you want to be a rabbi when you were a kid?
Actually, I wanted to become an actor.
What happened?
Well, my parents didn't want me to. They wanted me to become a rabbi. They said there was no future in acting.
The casting is spot on, I would say. Talk to me a little bit about how you found your perfect cast.
Well, you know, I cast in the traditional way, untraditionally, you know. There weren't features being made in New York at the time. It was sort of before the independent movement. And so when I would approach agents and so forth, you know, since it was mostly young people who were just starting out, I'd say, you know, I'd say, well, who do you have? Here's the script. It's a really interesting part. It's an independent film. And they would send me their clients. And what I did do is I went to SAG and I tried to negotiate a deal with the union to make sure that they could work comfortably, that it, you know, that I didn't have to use non-SAG people. And I didn't have a lawyer, so I just went myself. And I said, look, I can't pay SAG minimum. It was something like $500 a week. I didn't have that kind of money. So I said, what if I pay like half of that a week? And then when or if I'm able to sell the film, I will pay them back twice as much. You know, I'll pay them back $1,000 for every, you know, week. And I said, great. And SAG was amazing, right? So when I went to the agents, I was able to say, look, SAG is working with me on this. And they sent me people. And I just auditioned people the way one does. And I tell you, when Melanie came in, it was just clearly, she was Susan. And the same was true of Eric, and the same was true of Chris Guest. You know, they each brought so much specificity to their characters, so much background radiate. I mean, they just were whole complex people. They just weren't reading a scene. And I think Balaban's part is a particularly tough part because he's has to be kind of likable, but he's also sort of a nerd. But he also has to be really tough because he's tough enough that she had an abortion because she couldn't face telling him. She didn't think she'd be able to negotiate with him, you know, this. And that's a complicated part. That's a really complex and interesting part, as is Chris Guest, a guy who's very kind of, you know, like this, you know, pushing you away and asking you to come, you know, seducing you at the same time. So they both came so full. It was a no-brainer, but I saw hundreds of people. You know, they weren't the first 3 people who walked in, you know.
I'm sure.
Right, right.
And the costumes, I think, are really interesting. I don't think it's just because looking back and analysing the 70s fashions, they seem very well thought out.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell me more?
Susan's costumes were mostly my clothes.
Right.
Everything, the baggy red Guatemalan shirt, you know, everything. Chris Guest's costumes were all his. Yeah, everybody's costumes are mostly their own.
That's probably why they look so great. They just like
yeah. And I don't know whether you know, but we had to stop shooting because we had just planned on doing a 30-minute film that ends at around the time of, I forget what. And then when we started up again, I said, I called Chris. I said, do you have that blue sweater you wore in that scene? He said, I don't know, I'm gonna, and he didn't think he had it, and then he found it. It was like, there was no real continuity. I mean, you have to understand, this was a very stripped down set. Like Melanie was our still photographer, which is why we had no stills of her, right? If you have your lead being your still photographer, who are you gonna shoot? The other actors and the crew, right?
And once the film was out there, what kind of reactions did you have immediately? Because obviously it's now considered seminal, but what kind of response did it have at the beginning?
I think people were surprised to like it. Do you know what I mean? I mean, people genuinely liked it, but it made them feel good to like it, because they were liking something that was unconventional, an offbeat heroine that wasn't conventionally pretty, a story about not the usual protagonist. All the characters were, so they felt, it made them feel good in a way, because it's kind of stretched their zone, but they genuinely liked it. I think one of the things that was really important to me in terms of the film was the tone. This coming of age, this becoming herself is a big deal. It's a big struggle. It's hard work, but it is not to be taken. She needs to take it very seriously in her life, but if we take it too seriously, it lacks humor and it lacks the perspective of, she doesn't have it that rough, really, in context of a bigger life, right? So the humor that came from Vicky's screenplay and that got picked up again by Michael Small's score kind of kept you saying, hey, this is okay, you can laugh, it's okay. You're not laughing at her, you're laughing at the situation or with her or whatever. And I think the importance of telling the story with humor is part of the reason people were able to clue in and like it,
You mentioned Vicky. How closely did you work together to design? I know the story obviously came from you, and then in terms of the script, tell me how that relationship worked.
Well, we would get together at her apartment and we would talk about, okay, so what should come next? Okay, maybe it's a scene between the two of them and they're arguing about, why is she marrying him? Where should it be? Well, let's put it in a bar, okay, so, and then Vicky would go away and write it and bring me pages. And we'd sort of kind of work a number of scenes till we had a script. But she wrote it, I didn't write it.
And was there anything that you disagreed about, or did you tend to be on the same page?
I don't remember if there were disagreements. I think we were pretty much on the same page, I mean, clearly it was my movie and I'd hired her to write it, but she was the writer, So, I mean, I think we were very, we figured it out.
How do you think Making Girlfriends then impacted the rest of your career? Let's talk about what you did after that.
Well, I mean, I think it sort of put me on the map, so to speak. And because of it, I was able to, go out to LA where I sold it and then make another feature for Ray Stark called It's My Turn with Jill Clayburgh, Michael Douglas, and Charles Grodin. And I suppose I could have made some more, but I didn't really, making a film under those conditions. And I have to say, in the hotbed of misogyny that was Hollywood at the time, and particularly Ray Stark, who was a bit of an ogre. I mean, he would come on the set and run his hand down my back and say, oh, you're wearing a bra today, Claudia, what a pity.
Oh my God.
To the full set of like 83 union guys in their 50s, plus the cast, right? I mean, the struggle to get to, it's hard to make a film. It's hard to focus on the scene and figure out if it's working or not and what direction to give. And is this direction going to shut them down or is it going to help them? Or, you know, it's really hard to work on your feet and direct a scene and make a film. But to make a film with that was just like, why bother? Why? I don't need this. I don't need this. You know, I love directing. I didn't want to go back to all the people I'd asked so many favors of and ask favors again. And I started directing theater, which was fantastic. I directed a lot of theater for Joe Papp and the Public and the Manhattan Theater Club, and you know, and I started working with a lot of new young American playwrights, and that was fantastic. And you know, where I didn't have the concern of a whole lot of money like in Hollywood. And then I started directing TV, and of course, by the 80s, television was the beginning. The late 80s was the beginning of the Renaissance in television, where all the good writers were working for TV, you know, whether it was My So-Called Life, Winnie Holtzman, or 30 something, and, you know, all of those shows. And so it was really exciting, you know, and that kept going through to Girls, which was the last show I directed for TV. So I didn't miss directing features per se. I love telling stories. And for me, one of the thrills is going from one medium to the next. You know, in film, the director is the head of the most important person, but that's also a huge burden and huge pressure, right? In TV, you get to, you know, it's the executive producer, the writer producer that's the top, you know, and the director's the last person hired and the first person fired on a TV series. You know, it's not about the director, but the directing is really important, particularly if you're directing the first season of a show where you're trying to set the character and find the character, and how much can you push on likability and yet still, you know, just find the contours of the character. And that's what I was hired over and over to do, is the first season of shows, to help them find the tone and the characters. And that was fascinating work, as was theater, you know, because I was working with all my colleagues, my writer friends who were the same age. So I didn't particularly miss directing, certainly directing in Hollywood.
With the hotbed of misogyny. I'm sorry to hear that was one of the reasons you went the way you did, but at the same time, we're grateful for all the amazing work that you brought us. With Girlfriends now, just finally, because obviously it's being re-released in UK cinemas, any messages for people who are either revisiting it or seeing it on screen for the first time?
No, just really enjoy it, you know. I am stunned how the film still seems so timely, and people are watch it for the first time and it still speaks to their experience, or that it explains to them what's happening with their granddaughter or whatever, you know. It's as though the 40 years hadn't passed, because the emotional experience feels true to people. And I think because Melanie is so accessible. But there are kind of some amazing women film directors these days. I think it's pretty, you know, there are some great, you know, do you know the work of Eliza Hittman?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she was a student of mine actually at Cal Arts, and then later a colleague of mine when we were both teaching at Columbia. I mean, I think her films are exquisite. You know, I'm also a huge fan of Claire Denis.
Yeah.
I mean, she's just amazing. I mean, such poetic use of images, but at the same time, the way she focuses on kind of ordinary existences, but in extraordinary situations, you know, and also, I don't know, you know, the deep emotional, psychological reality that she portrays with such intimacy, you just feel like you're on this, you're traveling with these people. I mean, I think that's also what you feel like with Dee Reese and Pariah, say, right? Which is a beautiful film, or Alice Rohracher, whose films are so, I mean, there are even more philosophical and interesting, but they're also amazing humor. And there's a film I just saw recently, I don't know if you've seen this, which is The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. Did you see that?
No, I haven't seen that yet. Who directed that?
Her name is Elle Magie Tailfeathers. Okay. She's Indigenous, and Kate Hepburn, who I don't know if she's Indigenous or not, but it's about two Indigenous women in Canada. It's a Canadian film with kind of huge experiential chasm in terms of class, colorism. One is very dark, one's very pale. Education, one is a teacher, the other is kind of an abused, pregnant young woman with no job. And they collide in this kind of a really urgent story about race, motherhood, and domestic abuse. And it's told almost in one continuous shot. It's just beautiful filmmaking. And I'm not I'm not an easy touch in terms of crying. I think I sobbed through the whole film.
Well, that's some amazing recommendations there, Claudia. Thank you so much.
I mean, what all of these films have in common, I think, is great emotional truth, a great kind of experiential, where you sort of enter the experience of the character, and at the same time, really powerful political message. But the powerful message comes through the emotional experience. It's not in front of it, which is how it should work.
I could not agree more. And that's what we're always celebrating on Girls on Film. And of course, what we're celebrating with Women with Movie Cameras. So thank you so much, Claudia, for joining us today. It's been such an honor and great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great, Anna. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching and enjoy the rest of the summit. Girlfriends is re-released in UK cinemas, including the BFI South Bank on the 23rd of July. Enjoy.